This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot.
All right, folks, how we doing tonight? How are we doing? Okay, so we are going to go over the history of the Blue Beetle. The Blue Beetles, I should say. The whole franchise, as it were, tonight. It's a long, convoluted history involving 3 different comic book companies and a tangled mess of rights and 3 different characters bearing the name. Yes, Beckloff Super Secret Live Stream, members only. So we're gonna join Luke here in a second. Get the Hangouts link again. I know, super, very, very prepared for all my stuff. The height of professionalism. Let's get the. Hey, Luke, can you hear us all right?
Good morning, terrifying fantasy world.
Good morning.
All right, and it seems like we can hear you good. Okay, so let's go ahead and make sure everything's looking okay visually. All right.
Long time no see.
Indeed. Haven't been on here in a while. All right. So this character, this franchise, this saga is just about as old as superhero comics itself. So we're gonna have to start in the golden age, in the 40s. We got a Blue Beetle back then. Goes by the name of Dan Garrett. Luke, if you can bring up some images there for us. So Dan Garrett got his powers from, he was like an archaeologist, you know, kind of Indiana Jones type. There we got Ted and Dan together. And he finds this mystical scarab in somewhere in Egypt, but it also had something to do with aliens. Later we've come to find out, whatever. Point is, he finds this mystical scarab. It gives him all sorts of superpowers, and he calls himself the Blue Beetle. And in typical Golden Age fashion, his costume sucks. Because that was the Golden Age. But there we go, Dan Garrett. This was a company called Fox, I believe, had him at the time. And I can't find a lot of concrete evidence of even that. There's a book, Blue Beetle Companion, His Many Lives from 1939 Today by Christopher Irvin. He says the company was called Fox. I can't find that on any cover I've been able to find online, but whatever. Not important. So this is this crappy little Golden Age character we got running around. So, not a lot to talk about with Dan Garrett. Dan Garrett is not particularly interesting. But there he is. Dan Garrett, Blue Beetle. Really hard to find even reprints of this stuff. Interestingly enough, DC doesn't own him. Which we'll get into later. Dan Garrett is technically public domain. There's a handful of superheroes, mostly from the Golden Age, that have fallen into public domain, and really anybody could use. Death-defying Daredevil, for example. I believe Black Terror. I know Dynamite did a book about 10 years ago called Project Superpowers, where they basically gathered up every public domain hero they could think of and threw them together in a book. But yeah, Dan Garrett is sort of public domain. But it's a bit of an iffy issue because DC kind of owns the name Blue Beetle, but not this character. Anyways, fast forward to the Silver Age, around the 60s. This is when things get interesting. So this is when we get Ted Kord. We got a company called Charleston. They have a whole lineup of superheroes. The three most notable that are still relevant today are probably Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and The Question. The Question you may know as the best part of Justice League Unlimited. Um, this was the Charleston characters. Now, what makes the Dan or the Ted Cord in the Ted Cord Blue Beetle and the Question comics most interesting are Steve Ditko worked on those. He was the artist on both of them. Well, it was Blue Beetle, and then there were like Question backup stories, and had a hand in the plot. The most notable plot from this series, which, by the way, if you want to find these reprinted, look up a book, Action Heroes Volume 2, hardcover collection by DC. It's a pricey book originally. It's a $75 hardcover originally. But if you find it on Amazon, you can find it on Amazon for pretty cheap these days. But this reprints a ton of the Silver Age, Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and Question stories. The most notable of the Blue Beetle stories, in my opinion, well, two notable ones. You have one called R-Man. Let me see if I can find this one. This was Blue Beetle number 5, I believe. Here. Almost there. This is a story of, well, a lot of comics at the time. Luke, see if you can find a BB number 5 in your pictures there. A lot of comics at the time, it was a lot of that Spider-Man stuff of, the hippie counterculture, fight the man, all that kind of shit, right? And this was sort of, and it wasn't written by Steve Ditko, but there's a lot to suggest that he heavily influenced the plot because it drips of Steve Ditko's Ayn Rand. This is basically a comic that as almost a counterpoint to, Spider-Man comics at the day of, oh, the man's keeping. No, this is basically a comic that said, shut up, hippie, get a job. So the plot of this comic, you got, you see that character he's fighting there, R-Man? That's some statue that's at some art museum. Let me read you what the pompous art critic is saying of this statue. Here is what I call R-Man. This anonymous work is a perfect example of art that reveals the true spirit of man. Man as he really is. The entire form is nondescript, lacking the usual grotesque heroic pose. The missing eyes, a profoundly human touch which all men may identify with, dramatizes man's inevitable weakness. Notice, please, the lack of the touch of pure genius, the deliberate lack of heart, the faculty that man should obey, the closed hand symbolizing man's inability to solve or control the illusion we call existence. Yes, this is the true man. This is how we really are. No one can improve on it or escape it. We can only accept our man. And you see the janitor there like, it's true, that's exactly how I feel. An incompetent nothing in a world of mystic terrors, all without meaning or purpose. So later in this book, this janitor basically dismantles the R-Man statue and makes a suit of armor out of it and decides to fight Blue Beetle because he doesn't like a hero. He doesn't like the Blue Beetle's out there looking all heroic. And who the hell does he think he is? So he's going to go fight Blue Beetle. And almost gets the drop on Blue Beetle, but then Blue Beetle kicks his ass. And the guy gets away, and at the very end, nobody knows it was him, right? At the very end, he's thinking to himself, man is too helpless, unless he has some supernatural powers like the one Blue Beetle has to help him, which the Ted Cord Blue Beetle has no fucking superpowers. Now, what's it? Now, look, it's a cheesy Silver Age comic, but why I particularly enjoy this comic again, this is basically. I know it wasn't written by Steve Ditko, but I refuse to believe he didn't have a hand in plotting this. This is Steve Ditko's fuck you to a lot of comics at the time. This is him saying, "Go get a job, you filthy hippies." Indeed, with the loser janitor, I mean, he creates a suit of armor and goes toe to toe with a superhero. So, you know, it's not as if this idiot couldn't accomplish something if he actually tried. All in all, it's probably the height of the Silver Age stuff for Blue Beetle. Now, the reason, by the way, Blue Beetle, this is interesting. So when Charleston does its own version of Blue Beetle, initially they have no references to Dan Garrett. You just got this this Ted Cord guy, and he's sort of like a Batman. He's a billionaire, a billionaire now, you know, for inflation. Who you know, he's got all these gadgets. He's got his own, you know, big company that does all this tech stuff. He's sort of like Batman, you know, but not a moody emo guy. You know, he's like Batman if he could crack a fucking smile once in a while. Now, why is he called the Blue Beetle? Well, in issue, what was this? What issue number was it? Of course, they didn't even have a number on this title. I want to say it was like 3. But in issue 3 of it, we see that the reason he calls himself the Blue Beetle is he was actually friends with Dan Garrett. They actually introduced Dan Garrett. And him and Dan Garrett end up on this island where some mad scientist is creating these big, ugly, stupid orange robots. And Dan Garrett sort of sacrifices his life to stop these things, right? And as the Blue Beetle, he does this, and that's when that's when Ted Cord realizes, oh, my buddy Dan was the Blue Beetle. Dan Garrett passes the scarab that gives him the powers on to Ted Cord. Well, Ted Cord, for some reason, is never able to get the scarab to work. It just never gives him powers. It just won't activate for him. But he's like, I'm still going to take on my buddy's mantle. So he just becomes this tech-based kind of superhero. He becomes this Batman-type superhero, you know, just his fists and acrobatics and some gadgets, you know. He's never able to get the scarab to work. So that's how we end up with this new character, but they tie him into the original that I guess Charleston had bought the rights to. Again, I can't find a lot of concrete evidence on how this went from Fox Comics to Charleston Comics. Maybe Dan Garrett had already fallen in public domain at that time, but you got to remember, we're talking about the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There wasn't a ton of people keeping track back then. You know, wasn't a bunch of nerds on the internet keeping track of this sort of thing. So that's the Silver Age. Now, the Silver Age doesn't really have a lot of team-ups with all of Charleston characters, but it's just sort of implied they exist in the same universe. For example, we never see at least in the issues I've read, which I believe are all of them, we never see, for example, Blue Beetle and the Question, you know, teaming up. But in that R-Man story, we saw, for example, at that museum, Ted Cord out with his date, and we also saw Vic Sage, the Question, you know, his civilian identity, also at that museum. So it's implied that this is all a shared universe. The other major hero was Captain Atom, who is the only one of the Charleston characters really with any powers. He's not quite as powerful as, say, Dr. Manhattan, but he's this nuclear-powered, you know, superhero, you know, enhanced strength, durability, energy manipulation, flight, the whole 9 yards. Right now, Luke's throwing up a picture. It's a little fan-made thing there of Watchmen Charleston characters crossover. What's interesting there is the Watchmen characters are all based on the Charleston characters. Shortly after DC bought the rights to them in the 80s, Alan Moore wanted to do a story with them. And he showed it to DC, and DC's like, no, we have other plans for them. So Alan Moore then went ahead and reworked them all into his own original characters and created what would become Watchmen. So all the Watchmen characters are basically based on the Charleston characters. Night Owl is based on Blue Beetle. The Rorschach is based on the Question. Captain Atom based on, or not Dr. Manhattan based on Captain Atom, for example. To this day, Alan Moore is still pissed over the fact that he lost the rights to Watchmen. And the reason he lost the rights to Watchmen is because he signed a contract with DC that DC would retain the rights as long as Watchmen remained in print. Well, there has been a Watchmen trade paperback in print ever since. It's never gone out of print. Alan Moore is, to this day, deeply upset over the fact that he wasn't smarter than DC Comics lawyers. And he refuses to take responsibility for the fact that he signed a contract without reading it like a fucking moron. And, you know, okay, he wanted it published at DC. There were other alternatives. You know, don't forget, Eastman and Lord had self-published TMNT in 1984. Watchmen came out in 86, I believe it was. Dark Horse, I believe, existed at that time. Might have just come out, but point is, and Alan Moore already had the star power. He could have self-published this if he really, really believed in it and wanted to maintain the rights of his baby. But no, he was lazy and stupid, and he paid a price for it. And, you know, I'm lazy and stupid sometimes, and I pay a price for it, but I don't spend 40 years blaming the man and the system. What's also funny is Rorschach is a big old fuck you to Steve Ditko. Rorschach is meant to be somebody you find contemptible in Watchmen because he's based on The Question, which was... The Question was the purest distillation of Steve Ditko's objectivism, Ayn Rand philosophy in these comics. However, if you read Watchmen, Rorschach is the only one with a moral compass in the bunch. Say what you will about his philosophy, but he's the only one with any kind of true principles. Alan Moore attempts to make Rorschach look bad in The Watchmen. He doesn't really succeed. I could go off about Watchmen for a while. Watchmen is a good read, and I even think the movie's pretty good. The ending is actually better than the book. Watchmen is highly overrated. I don't take the razor fist position that Watchmen's garbage and Alan Moore sucks. Alan Moore's a decent writer. Watchmen's a good read. But the idea that it is the end-all and be-all of superhero comics, as many people want to go on about, that's just not the case.
Character Rorschach in Alan Moore's classic graphic novel, Watchmen.
And they said, well, it's got this character in called Rorschach. And he said, oh, yes, Rorschach. He's like Mr. A, except he's insane.
Yeah, but he really wasn't. He just really wasn't. All right, so that's the Charlton era. Come the 80s, DC buys the rights to these characters, and they were snatching up the rights to a lot of things around that time. And DC had a vast multiverse going on at that point, which they do now, but for example, all the Golden Age DC stories and all the Silver Age DC stories are two different continuities, two different universes. We have a storyline called Crisis on Infinite Earths, which results in a merged Earth at the end of it, merging all this into one timeline. And you got characters like Captain Marvel's Shazam, who existed in his own universe prior to this. Again, the Charlton characters, Captain Atom, Question, Blue Beetle, etc., existing in their own universe prior to this. Earth 4, I believe it was called, because we have a new Earth 4 that's sort of based on them, which we'll talk about later. But after this, everything is merged, and the timeline. That's the new Earth 4, by the way. They created a new Earth 4 where, coming full circle, the new Earth 4 featured in a recent series called Multiversity is basically Watchmen. It's basically Watchmen. So we go on full circle to the Charlton characters now ripping off Watchmen, which is interesting. I mean, you can see that version of Captain Atom looks exactly like Dr. Manhattan. And anyways, after this, the timelines are, I guess the universes are merged into one. So that, for example, Blue Beetle exists in the DC universe now. And as far as he knows, he's always existed in the DC universe. Same with the rest of them. After this, we get Blue Beetle joining the Justice League along with characters like Captain Atom. In the 90s, or maybe it was even like around the late 90s, early 2000s, we even had a book called Law, like an acronym, LAW, which was a team that featured all the classic Charlton characters, but existing in the DC universe. Just sort of a Justice League offshoot, as it were. But at this point, you know, Blue Beetle gets his own series in the 80s, which is really good. Captain Atom gets his own series too. Question does not, but he appears a lot in Blue Beetle's series, for example. This is when we get a bit of a different take. We get a far less serious Ted Kord at this point. Ted Kord was in the Silver Age. He wasn't a moody emo Batman type, but he was your square jaw hero, super serious guy. I would almost say his personality was a slightly less corny version of Adam West's Batman in the Silver Age. But after the 80s, when we work them into the DC universe, see, the problem with a lot of these characters getting folded into the DC universe, while it's very cool to have them in a shared universe, there can come a point where they're just sort of lost in the shuffle. And that happened to a lot of the Charlton characters. Basically, like I said, only Captain Atom, Question, and Blue Beetle would pretty much remain irrelevant over the years. So in the Justice League, Ted Kord ends up befriending a character called Booster Gold. Booster Gold is a character that has traveled back in time from the future, and is a big old glory hound, kind of arrogant dude who just wants to be famous and be liked, pretty much. Him and Ted Kord over the years end up with this very interesting friendship where they're sort of they become the comic relief of a lot of Justice League runs. But it works out really well. And again, they do end up with a very very interesting friendship about them. This goes on for a while. Blue Beetle sort of falls out of the limelight for a while, and after a while we see him come back, and he's actually gotten kind of fat. Like, he hasn't been doing superhero stuff at all. So he's found himself not quite up for it anymore, and suddenly needing to train again and all this other stuff. Then we come to a storyline right before Infinite Crisis. There's a one-shot called Countdown to Infinite Crisis, where there's a bunch of bad shit going on behind the scenes, and again, not all that relevant, but there was a guy named Max Lord, and he was a guy who was actually one of the government liaisons to the Justice League, and he was one of the people, he was like a billionaire guy that was funding them, and all this other stuff. Well, it turned out he was actually a shithead, and he was actually doing a lot of bad stuff behind the scenes. And Blue Beetle ends up following the trail, as it were, and uncovers what Max Lord was up to. And this results in Ted Kord getting shot right in the head, and he's dead now. And that was one of the catalysts to a storyline called Infinite Crisis. And also, we're going to probably see some of this, minus the Blue Beetle part, play out in the new Wonder Woman movie, because Max Lord is the villain in the new Wonder Woman movie. And during Infinite Crisis, Wonder Woman will occasionally kill. In most DC continuities, Wonder Woman will occasionally snap a nigga's neck. And that's exactly what she did to Max Kord. He had taken mental control of Superman and was like, look what I'm going to do now. I got Superman. I'm going to do all this fucked up shit. And Wonder Woman's like, yeah, I don't think you are. Switched his head around 180. Which didn't sit well with the rest of the Justice League. But she's like, hey, what do you want from me? Need it done. During Infinite Crisis, a little Spanish kid living in Texas by the name of I'm an American, so I say it Jamie Reyes, but I guess it's Jaime Reyes is how you pronounce it. This kid he somehow gets a hold of the Scarab that never worked for Dan Garrett, or never worked for Ted Kord. I mean, Dan Garrett's Scarab, and he becomes the new Blue Beetle. And the Scarab is basically like gives him all these Magitech powers with this really badass looking armor and stuff like that. And I never liked this character. I could never get into him. I just couldn't. He looks badass. Don't get me wrong. I want to like him. I really do. All right, but this is I feel like, now this is '06 we get this character introduced, by the way. So it was before comics were really, really full of a lot of paz and soy and diversity hires and all the obnoxious stuff you see now. But this really felt like, I mean, poor Ted Kord lost his job to a Mexican. Isn't that the sad state of America? But seriously, I just can't get into this character. For one thing, I'm not particularly fond of teen superheroes. Never have been. I don't understand why every adaptation of Spider-Man outside of the comics wants to reduce him back to a teenager and keep him that way, like that was ever all that interesting. I've never been a fan of teen superheroes. I'm late for school again because I was doing superhero stuff. Tell that story for the billionth fucking time. It doesn't interest me. Really doesn't. Also, I just never really felt like I was ever given much of a reason to give a shit about this character. And I've tried to hop into it a few times, and I just can't get behind him. And he has a fan base. It's not like Captain Marvel. Okay, it's not like the Muslim Miss Marvel or something where no one actually likes this character. It's just pushed by... No, a lot of people really, really like this character. I've gotten a lot of shit over the years for not liking this character. But I'm sorry. He just doesn't do it for me. I miss Ted Kord. I miss Ted Kord something fierce. So, yeah, this is the new Blue Beetle. So... After a while, we get a storyline popping up in the Green Lantern books in the late 2000s called Blackest Night. And this was during Jeff Jones' run on Green Lantern, which, by the way, is the best run on Green Lantern. Jeff Jones from Rebirth in, I think, around '04 or '05 to Blackest Night in, like, '09. Amazing stuff. So the deal with Blackest Night, Jeff Jones... he does something to the Green Lantern mythos that becomes such a welcome addition that it's almost hard to believe it wasn't always there. In the past, we had the Green Lantern rings that were powered by Will, and we had the yellow rings that were powered by Fear, but that's all we had. Well, Jeff Jones has the idea, I'm gonna expand this into an entire spectrum. So over the course of his run, he introduces the Red Lanterns, which are powered by anger, rage. The singular Orange Lantern, who's powered by avarice. Obviously, we had the yellow and green. Then we had the Blue Lanterns, powered by hope. Indigo Lanterns are powered by compassion. And the Star Sapphires, we had already sort of seen, but they weren't rings. This is when we first see them as rings. They're powered by love. And you'll notice there's two other symbols there. We got the White Lanterns, which are the embodiment of life. And the Black Lanterns are powered by death. The Black Lanterns... Basically a character, Necron, who sort of looks like the spirit of death, but he actually identifies as the darkness that existed in the universe before the light. And he considers light and life to be the invaders into his territory and wishes to make them go away. So he's created these Black Lantern rings that raise the dead, essentially, and turn them into these horrifying lantern ring powered zombies. Blackest Night is a fantastic read. Highly suggest checking it out. Well, of course, poor old Ted Kord gets the Black Lantern treatment. And the thing about Black Lanterns, they don't just go on a full-on rampage. They try to elicit a strong emotional response in their targets and then feed off that, essentially. In other words, they try to get you to feel almost as pure of an emotion as possible, be it rage, fear, whatever. And at that moment, that's when they can feed on you, which is powering the big Black Lantern battery, which Necron's going to try and use to destroy the universe. So in the Booster Gold series at the time, you have a really interesting couple issue story arc of Booster Gold, and the Mexican Blue Beetle hops in there too, dealing with the Black Lantern Ted Kord. And again, these things have all the memories of the people they're reanimating. They actually are not the people they're reanimating. And we saw this at one point in the Blackest Night saga. A character called Deadman, who's a ghost, who can, he's just a ghost. He can possess people's bodies, and he's had all sorts of interactions with other DC heroes. His body is actually resurrected by a Black Lantern ring, and it starts going on a rampage. Well, that's sort of about the time they realize, well, these Black Lanterns aren't actually the people we know. Because if Deadman's soul is right here, but his body is running around, then obviously these things are just resurrecting these bodies with the memories, and they're not actually the people we know. Which sort of was one of the pivoting points when, we realized we really didn't have to worry about dealing with these things. Anyways, this goes on. Eventually, they sever the connection to the Black Ring, and to prevent that from happening again during this crisis, Booster Gold, who again is a time traveler, literally travels to this place called Vanishing Point, which is this base that exists like outside of time, and buries Ted Kord's body there. So that's the Black Lantern saga, which again, highly suggest checking out Blackest Night. And really, all the tie-ins are great too. So that's the in-continuity saga of the Blue Beetle, as it were. A few side notes, though. We almost had Ted Kord Blue Beetle in Arrow, in the show Arrow. Kord Industries is mentioned a tremendous amount of times throughout that, and supposedly writers wanted to use that, but for whatever reason they didn't get around to it. They weren't sure who to cast, and then they had to get permission from Warner Brothers as to exactly what characters they can use, all that kind of stuff. And it just, rumor is part of the reason that didn't happen is because DC Comics is hell-bent on pushing the new Blue Beetle over Ted Kord. Other interesting side note, there's a comic right now called Beetle Girl. This is being published by a little independent company. I think it's like Lucky Star Comics or something like that. They have a little symbol of like a 4-leaf clover. Beetle Girl is, again, it's an independent comic. It's Dan Garrett's granddaughter using the Scarab and taking on his mantle. Because again, Dan Garrett's sort of public domain. It's a little iffy on whether or not you could use the name Blue Beetle if you were using that character, like, or at least on a cover. You know what I mean? But the character itself is public domain. I've wanted to read this Beetle Girl comic for a while, by the way. I've routinely messaged the guy that makes this comic and have said, do you have a trade paperback of this? Because I'm not going to hunt down the individual issues. I'm not going to order the individual issues of this online. Like when he puts out a trade paperback, I intend to check it out. It seems interesting. But that's the little side notes we got there. That's about it. That is the convoluted and long history of the Blue Beetle franchise. Again, Ted Kord Blue Beetle is one of my favorite characters. The Question probably a bit more so. I also really like the overall kind of Charlton universe, and I really wish DC had a universe in its multiverse that was just them and not ripping off Watchmen. The Silver Age Blue Beetle stuff is, again, if you can find Action Heroes Volume 2 online for a decent amount of, for not stupid amounts of money, I highly suggest checking it out, because there's a lot of interesting, particularly with the Blue Beetle and Question stories, a lot of interesting Silver Age superheroics, but done with that sort of Steve Ditko, Ayn Rand type stuff to it. It's also got a bunch of classic Captain Atom stuff, which is fine. The Captain Atom stuff really reads like very, very hokey. Basically, imagine very, very hokey 50s science fiction movies, and you have classic Silver Age Captain Atom. They're fine. I enjoyed them, but they're definitely not what I bought the book for. Action Heroes Volume 1 is exclusively Captain Atom stories prior to this, which, again, that's why I don't have Action Heroes Volume 1. Action Heroes Volume 1 is actually a little cheaper, too, but Volume 2 is, it's just, like I said, it's a $75 hardcover new, but it's not going to run you that if you look on Amazon. I mean, I fucking paid that for it back in the day because I'm a huge fucking nerd. But you do not need to do that these days. Actually, I didn't. I got this as a birthday present years and years and years ago. Girl I was seeing at the time saw me continuously drooling over it at the comic book store and not able to justify it because it was so damn expensive. Also of note in here, there is an unpublished issue of Blue Beetle in the back, and it's all black and white because it was never... it's just the line art for it. It's just the penciling and the inking for it. It never got published for whatever reason. There's a couple of unpublished Captain Atom stories back here too, that just never saw the light of day until this hardcover, I believe, was the first time it got published. So that is the history of one of the odd little heroes to run through the DC universe. Let's check. Oh, we got some cosplay there. So I'm gonna check the chat a little bit, and then maybe we'll see what's going on from there. Black Lanterns retain the memories of the host bodies. Yes, that's true. You hated the emotional spectrum. I'm shocked at that. I think Jeff Jones, and the best part about Jeff Jones' Green Lantern run is that you could see in the earliest issues of the Rebirth storyline where he brought back Hal, you could see he was heading towards Blackest Night. He knew exactly. It's one of those runs where a creator got on a book and he knew exactly where he wanted to take it for years to come. And now after Blackest Night, you could tell Jeff Jones just sort of was plodding along, like, kind of playing it by ear because he was out of ideas. There was a similar situation where Starskansky, I'm probably mispronouncing that, JMS, the Babylon 5 creator, he had a Spider-Man run sort of called the Totem Saga. And that went on for about 3 years, and he knew exactly where he wanted to go with that. And then when that kind of ran its course, he was just still on the book and just sort of came up with some really shitty stuff. But yeah, Jeff Jones' Green Lantern stuff is fantastic. Again, checking the chat here. Backloff Super Secret Stream, yes indeed. Dan and his sidekick Sparkington is public domain. I didn't even know he had a sidekick. Again, I haven't had a chance to read almost any of the Golden Age stuff. I really have not found that reprinted anywhere. I've read like bits and pieces. I've read like one or two issues of it online, I found, but the third Blue Beetle armor was inspired by the Kingdom Come Blue Beetle along with the Guyver. Yeah, there's in the Kingdom Come universe, which is also a pretty good read if you haven't read it. It takes place in like a possible future, and Ted Kord finally gets the Blue Beetle armor to work, or the Blue Beetle scarab to work, and he has a big armor about that. Let's see. Oh, apparently the DC version of Dan Garrett has 2 R's in his name, and the public domain only has 1 R. That's interesting. They actually changed the spelling of his name. Nightshade 2, which inspired Silk Spectre. Yes, that's another Charlton character. Alan Moore almost went with its Archie Red Shield characters to use for Watchmen, which DC had the rights to at the time as well. That's interesting. Are the Red Circle ones? DC got the rights for them again, like in the late 2000s. Not a comic book guy, but I own the Watchmen graphic novel. It's an awesome read. It is a good read. Don't get me wrong. When I say Watchmen is overrated, and I do stand by that, I mean for the simple fact that people treat it as if it's the ultimate in superhero storytelling, which I just don't think it is. Watchmen is a deconstruction of superhero storytelling, which is fine. I don't mind those kind of stories. You know, every once in a while, it's good to take something apart because that helps you figure out how it works. But it is easier to take something apart than to build something. I attempted to watch the new Watchmen on HBO, but it seemed paused, so I turned it off. Yeah, I've heard nothing but bad things about it, and it's so insanely far removed from the source material. Somebody says I got into I remember those 2 characters. I got into collecting just as Infinite Earths ended, JLA with Booster Days. Yep, it's let's see. Another fun part of Blackest Night, the Black Lantern rings couldn't reanimate the body of Don Hall, the Dove from Hawk and Dove. Oh yeah, because he had too much of the white light of life in him or whatever. You know what else was cool? Back then, certain issues of Blackest Night and certain tie-in issues actually came with lantern rings. Like you could get just the issue by itself, but I think for like $1 more, or 50 cents more or something like that, you got the ring with it, or maybe it was as supplies last or whatever with the tie-in rings. But you could, and I did because I was a big old nerd, you could get actual rings of all the Spectrum things. So like up in a drawer upstairs, I have all the rings, white, black, and the 7 Spectrum colors. And yes, I did buy a tie-in issue. A couple of tie-in issues I didn't even want to get those. Like, I think I got like a tie-in issue of Doom Patrol, and I didn't give a shit about Doom Patrol, but I was like, damn it, I'm getting that ring. Well, those are a lot fancier, the ones you're showing me, Luke. The ones I got were just solid colors. There they are. I got all those. And I ate that shit up. I was so excited about that, too. Because Blackest Night was so fucking good, too. But every one of those, I was like, yes, I gotta get them all. I think Spoonie actually did a storyline where he became a Black Lantern for a while because he died. You know, because I was back when review shows all had to have fucking stupid storylines. Yes, indeed, I am a nerd, chat. That's right. I still have those rings, and I will not part with those rings either. If I ever cosplayed, I'd go as a fucking lantern of one of those colors. Probably a red lantern. Because let's be real. You know, if those rings were real and I got any one of them, it'd be the Red Lantern ring. Okay? Because I am an angry motherfucker sometimes. But yeah, I love Jeff Jones' Green Lantern run. All right, looks like we're about caught up for the chat there. All right, well, I'm not going to drag this on. Because, you know, I just wanted to go over this. It's something that interests me. I've always loved this character, always will. I might go over the Jeff Jones Green Lantern run at some point later. I love that cosplay picture, too, Luke. That's fucking great. Oh, man. I love that Ted Kord had a big flying, like, hovercraft shaped like a giant beetle, too. Like, I love all his goofy fucking gadgets and shit. Oh. But yes, if you're someone that at all enjoys Silver Age comics, I highly suggest Action Heroes Volume 2. You probably find it on Amazon for cheap. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Luke, as always, thanks for your sidekick duties.
Always a pleasure.
And I don't know when I'm going to be back on here, guys. I just felt like, you know, banging this one out because, you know, I wanted to do it for a while. And, you know, like, I don't know. Everybody's doing, like, the Comicsgate drama streams, and I got invited onto some of those, and it's fine, but it's like I just don't want to... I don't want to do Gamergate again. I did it already. I want to just do it again. Oh.
Isn't that for more boring people? Let's have some fun.
Yeah, I'd rather talk about stuff I like. Like, there's so many comic channels where it's like all they want to do is like, look, guys, I got the latest issue of Muslim Miss Marvel and it's terrible. I'm like, of course it's terrible. Like, it's always been terrible. Why are you buying it? I mean, at a certain point, this just becomes like, guys, I found some dog shit on the street and I smelled it and it didn't smell good. Well, yes, thank you for that. Thank you for letting us know that the thing we all knew was terrible is indeed terrible. I guess that gets the views, but it's just not something I want to do. I love the guy who's doing that cosplay too. The dorky smile really fucking sells it. Oh, good times. All right. Well, I'll probably be back at some point. I don't know.